The auctioneer turned the key one last time. Click. Nothing. No crank. No cough. No smoke. Just the dry metallic snap of a machine everyone in the yard had already pronounced dead. Scrap. Somebody called from the back. A few men laughed. Then an old farmer near the fence slowly raised his bidding card. $140. The laughter got louder. For nearly 3 hours. Tractors, plows, wagons, and rusted implements had rolled across the auction block beneath a hard afternoon sun. Buyers walked around each machine with coffee in one hand and years of opinions in the other. But nobody had bothered looking twice at the faded red tractor sitting at the far end of the yard. Its hood was bleached almost pink. One rear tire was cracked. Rust crawled around the exhaust stack. And according to the paper wired to the steering wheel, the tractor had not run in more than 4 years. The auction crew had already tried a fresh battery, then jumper cables, then a second battery. Each time, the starter hit hard, and the engine refused to turn. That was enough for most of the men standing around it. Locked motor, probably froze up sitting. Needs a rebuild? Worth more by the pound. The auctioneer looked across the crowd. Do I hear 150? Silence. The old farmer stood alone with his card still raised. His name was Walter Hale, 71 years old. Sun-browned face, gray work shirt, boots worn smooth at the toes. He didn't look excited. That was the strange part. A man near the loading gate leaned toward his friend and said loudly enough for Walter to hear, "He'll spend more getting that thing home than the tractor's worth." Another man called out, "You buying a tractor or a lawn ornament?" Walt? Walter never turned around. He kept staring at the machine, not at the tires, not at the rust, not even at the engine block. His eyes stayed on one small area near the front of the tractor. The auctioneer waited another second. 140 once. Walter lowered his card. 140 twice. A few men were still chuckling. Then the hammer came down. Sold. $140. More laughter. Walter walked toward the tractor without saying a word. The auctioneer was already moving on to the next lot. But Walter crouched beside the machine. He wiped 2 fingers through the dust, reached under the side panel, touched something, then stopped. For the first time all afternoon, a faint smile crossed his face. One of the men nearby noticed. "What?" Walter looked up. "What are you smiling at?" Walter stood slowly and wiped his hand on his jeans. "If that engine's dead," the man said, "you just bought yourself 1,400 pounds of trouble." Walter glanced back at the tractor. Maybe. That was all he said, because Walter wasn't certain yet. But he had noticed something no one else in that auction yard had bothered to check. Something small enough to ignore. Something simple enough to dismiss. And if he was right, the engine everyone had called seized, ruined, and worthless, might never have been dead at all. Walter Hale had never been the kind of man who believed a machine was finished just because someone said it was. He had grown up in a place where nothing was replaced until every possible repair had failed. His father farmed 80 acres of corn, hay, and pasture with equipment that was already old when Walter was a boy. Their tractors leaked oil. Their baler needed a kick in exactly the right place before the knotter would behave. Their pickup had one door that only opened from the outside. Nothing on that farm was pretty, but almost everything worked. And when something stopped working, Walter's father never began by asking how much a new one cost. He began with the same question every time. What changed? Walter first heard that question when he was 12. A tractor had quit in the middle of cutting hay, and Walter had immediately assumed the engine was ruined. His father climbed down, listened for less than a minute, then removed a clogged fuel line. 10 minutes later, the tractor was running again. Walter remembered staring at him as if he had performed magic. His father had laughed. "Machines don't do magic," he said. "They give you clues. You just have to stop guessing long enough to see them." Walter never forgot that. By 16, he could change points, clean a carburetor, replace a belt, and tell the difference between a weak battery and a starter dragging under load. By 25, he had rebuilt his first engine on a plywood table inside an unheated barn. Beforte. Neighbors were bringing him equipment they had already given up on. Not because Walter owned fancy diagnostic tools. He didn't. Most of his tools had scratches deeper than their brand names. What Walter had was repetition, thousands of starts, thousands of failures, cold mornings when engines turned slowly, hot afternoons when fuel vapor locked in the lines, belts that screamed before braking, bearings that whispered before seizing, starters that sounded healthy but weren't. He had spent most of his life learning that the noise a machine made when it failed could matter as much as the failure itself. But the world around him had changed. New tractors came with computers, sensors, error codes, sealed components, and service manuals thick enough to stop a door. Walter respected all of it. He was not one of those old men who believed everything new was foolish. Modern machines could do things the equipment of his youth never could. But old tractors had one advantage he understood intimately. They were honest. When something stopped, the cause was usually still there in front of you. Fuel, air, spark, compression, rotation. Something was missing. Something was stuck. Something was out of time. And if you were patient, the machine usually told you where to look. That was why the tractor at the auction bothered him. Not because it was cheap. Not because it was old. Because the explanation everyone accepted did not match what Walter had heard. A truly locked engine had a certain finality to it, a particular kind of resistance, a particular kind of sound. The tractor on the block had sounded wrong. Not healthy, but wrong in a different way. Walter had noticed it the first time the auction crew connected a battery. The starter slammed into engagement. There was a sharp mechanical load. Then nothing. A man beside Walter immediately said, "Seized solid." Walter said nothing. The crew tried again. Same result. Someone else repeated the diagnosis. Locked motor. By the third attempt, the phrase had become fact. That was how things often happened in crowds. One man guessed. Another agreed. A third repeated it with confidence. Soon, nobody remembered that the first statement had only been a guess. Walter had seen the same thing happen with cattle, crops, weather, and machinery. People trusted certainty faster than they trusted observation. He didn't. So, before the bidding started, Walter had walked once around the tractor. He checked the ground beneath it, looked at the exhaust, studied the belts. Then he crouched near the front and noticed one small detail. He did not know yet whether it meant anything. But it was enough to keep him standing there when everyone else walked away. Enough to make him raise his card. Enough to risk $140. Because Walter had learned something over nearly 60 years around old machinery. A dead machine and a misunderstood machine could look exactly the same, until someone checked the right thing. The tractor had not arrived at the auction under its own power. It came on a flatbed. That alone told buyers something. The faded red machine had belonged to a small farm 20 miles north of town. For years, it had mowed pasture, pulled wagons, and run a hay rake. Then the owner died. The tractor stayed behind. For 4 years, it sat beneath a 3-sided equipment shed, dry enough to avoid direct rain, not dry enough to escape humidity. Mitre, dust, and 4 winters of doing nothing. When the family finally cleared the property, the tractor went to auction with the rest of the equipment. The auction company tried to start it before the sale. A worker installed a charged battery, turned the key. The starter engaged hard. The engine did not move. They tried again. Same result. Then they connected jumper cables from a pickup. Clunk. Load. Stop. To most experienced buyers, the possibilities narrowed quickly. Starter problem. Damaged ring gear. Or the expensive answer. Seized engine. By auction morning, the expensive answer had become the popular one. Walter heard it everywhere. Locked motor. Probably rusted in the cylinders. Been sitting too long? One man lifted the hood, looked for less than 30 seconds, and walked away. Another checked the dipstick. A third pointed toward the cracked rear tire. Even if the engine's good, you'll have money in this thing before it ever sees a field. None of them sounded foolish. That was important. Walter had rebuilt enough engines to know exactly what 4 years of sitting could do. Moisture could enter a cylinder, rings could stick, valves could seize, bearings could corrode. Old fuel could turn to varnish, and an engine rebuild could turn a cheap tractor into an expensive mistake before the first usable hour. Walter understood why nobody wanted the gamble. What bothered him was something else. The sound. Each time the starter engaged, it hit hard, immediately, as though it had reached a wall. That could mean a seized engine, but Walter had learned not to confuse a convincing symptom with a proven cause. After the crowd moved away, he stepped closer. He checked the oil, dark, but not milky. Looked along the block. No obvious crack. Studied the ground beneath the machine. Nothing dramatic. Then he moved toward the front of the tractor. That was when he noticed it. The belt. At first, there was nothing remarkable about it. Old, glazed, weathered. Then Walter pressed it with his thumb. Almost no movement. He pressed again. Too tight. His eyes followed the belt toward one of the front pulleys. Most of the metal was dull with age, but along one edge ran a narrow, bright mark. Fresh-looking metal. Walter leaned closer. A machine that had supposedly done nothing for 4 years was showing evidence that something near the front had recently tried to move, or had been forced against something that would not. Behind him, one of the auction workers turned the key again. Clunk. Nothing. Someone laughed. See? Lock solid. Walter did not answer. He kept looking at the belt. Then the pulley. Then back toward the engine. The crowd had asked, "Why won't the engine turn?" Walter was beginning to ask a different question. What if the resistance was not inside the engine? A belt connected the crankshaft to other components. If one of those components had seized completely, the starter would not care where the resistance came from. It would only know that something refused to move. From 20 feet away, the result might look exactly the same. Clunk. Load. Stop. Walter placed 2 fingers against the belt again. Still tight. He could not prove the engine was healthy. He could not prove the crowd was wrong. For all he knew, the cylinders really were rusted solid. But now the diagnosis had a hole in it. One small detail did not fit. And Walter had spent too many years around machines to ignore a detail simply because everyone else had already agreed on an answer. He stepped back from the tractor. Soon the bidding would begin. Most buyers had already decided what the machine was worth. Scrap. Walter had not decided anything yet. He only knew what he wanted to test. Before opening the engine, before buying parts, before assuming the worst, he wanted to remove one source of resistance and ask a simpler question. Could the engine turn without it? Walter did not bid because he knew the tractor was good. He bid because one detail refused to fit the story everyone else had accepted. The belt. More specifically, the way it sat against the front pulley. Old belts sagged. They cracked. They glazed over and slipped. Sometimes they snapped without warning. Walter had seen all of it. But this belt did not look loose. It looked trapped. There was tension in it, even with the engine sitting still. Too much tension. And on one side of the pulley, a thin, bright scar cut through years of dust and surface rust. That mark bothered him. Machines left evidence. Not explanations. Evidence. Walter crouched lower and ran a finger along the edge of the pulley. The metal was smooth where something had rubbed against it. Not decades ago. Recently. He looked around to see if anyone was watching. Most of the buyers had already lost interest. The auction had moved on to a cultivator 2 rows away, and the crowd followed the sound of the auctioneer. Walter stayed behind. He pressed the belt again. Hard. Almost no give. Then he reached toward the pulley and tried to move it. Nothing. He changed his grip. Still nothing. Walter stopped. That alone did not prove anything. A seized engine could hold every belt-driven component perfectly still. But Walter was not testing the engine. Not yet. He was trying to understand where the resistance might begin. He looked at the belt path carefully. From the crank pulley, up around the driven components, back across the front of the engine. If one of those components had locked solid, the starter would not care where the resistance came from. It would only know that something would not turn. To the man holding the key, the result could look almost identical. Click. Load. Stop. Walter stood and stepped back. He pictured the sound again. The starter had not sounded weak. It had sounded like it hit a wall. That was why everyone said seized. But an engine was not the only thing capable of becoming a wall. He had learned that lesson 40 years earlier, on a hay tractor that had quit during the hottest week of July. Back then, Walter had spent half a morning convinced he had destroyed an engine. His father had let him worry. Let him check the oil. Let him pull the plugs. Let him curse. Then the old man had pointed toward the front of the tractor and said, "You're looking inside the engine because you're scared of the expensive answer." Walter had never forgotten what came next. Start with what you can prove. That memory came back now. Not because this tractor was the same. It wasn't. But because the mistake was. People were already imagining pistons rusted to cylinder walls. Bent roes. Ruined bearings. A complete rebuild. They had jumped straight to the worst possible explanation. Walter wasn't ready to do that. He moved around to the other side and inspected the block. No obvious crack. No fresh oil running down the casting. No coolant streaking from the head. The dipstick oil was dark, but not milky. None of that proved the engine was healthy. A machine could be badly damaged and still look clean from the outside. But every missing sign mattered. Walter had spent enough time repairing machinery to know that diagnosis was often less about finding one dramatic clue than eliminating a dozen wrong ones. He glanced back toward the auction crew. One of the workers was preparing to move the tractor after the sale. Walter walked over. "Don't try starting it again." The worker looked at him. "Why?" Walter nodded toward the machine. "Just leave it." The man shrugged. "Your tractor?" Walter returned to the front of the engine. For another 30 seconds. He said nothing. Then he reached under the side panel once more. This time, he placed 2 fingers against the belt, followed it down, and stopped at the same pulley. He could not identify the failure yet. He could not guarantee the engine was sound. And he certainly could not prove the crowd was wrong. But he knew what he would do first when the tractor reached his barn. He would not rebuild the engine. He would not buy parts. He would not even try to start it. He would remove one source of resistance from the system. Then he would ask the tractor one simple question. Can the engine turn without it? By the time the auctioneer reached the old red tractor, Walter had already made his decision. Not about the engine, about the risk. He still did not know whether the engine was good. The cylinders could be rusted. The crankshaft could be damaged. The tractor could contain problems he had not seen yet. All Walter knew was that one detail did not fit the diagnosis everyone else had accepted. The belt was too tight. The pulley carried a fresh wear mark, and something at the front of the engine appeared to have been fighting against movement. That was not proof, but at the right price, it was enough for a test. The auctioneer slapped the faded hood. Non-running. Selling as is. Someone asked whether the engine was free. A yard worker shook his head. Wouldn't turn. Several buyers immediately stepped back. Walter did not. Who'll give me 300? Silence. 200? Nothing. A scrap buyer finally offered 100. The auctioneer looked around. 120? The scrap buyer raised his hand. Walter waited. Then came the number he had already decided he could afford to lose. 140? Walter raised his card. 140. A few men laughed. Someone behind him said, "There goes $140. Another voice answered, "Plus hauling." Walter heard them. He kept his eyes on the tractor. The scrap buyer considered another bid, then shook his head. "He can have it." The hammer fell. Sold. $140. That was it. No dramatic victory. No secret revealed. Walter had just spent $140 on a tractor that might still be exactly what everyone believed it was. A mistake. A younger man from the crowd walked past him. "You really think that motor isn't locked?" Walter shook his head. "I don't know." The man stopped. "You don't know?" "No." "Then why buy it?" Walter glanced toward the front pulley. "Because I want to check something." The man laughed. $140 for a guess? Walter considered the word. Pretty much. But it was not quite a guess. A guess said, "The engine is good." Walter was saying something narrower. The evidence did not yet prove the engine was bad. There was a difference. He had spent most of his life learning that difference could save a man a great deal of money, or cost him some. At the cashier window, the clerk looked at the lot number. "You bought the dead one?" Walter slid the money across the counter. "Looks that way." She handed him the receipt. "By Sushermayuan." Walter folded it once and placed it in his shirt pocket. That little piece of paper now represented the maximum price of his first question. If the engine was truly seized, Walter would own a cheap parts tractor and a useful reminder not to trust every hunch. If the engine could turn once the belt-driven resistance was removed, then the entire auction yard had judged the machine by a symptom without locating its cause. Either way, Walter would have an answer. He walked back toward the tractor. The auction had already moved on. Nobody was watching anymore. Walter preferred it that way. He rested one hand against the faded hood. He still did not know whether he had bought a bargain. He did not know whether the tractor would ever run again. But he knew exactly what he would do when it reached home. No new battery, no engine rebuild, no expensive parts. First, he would remove the belt from the equation. Then he would try to turn the engine itself. 800 au fur. Walter had not bought certainty. He had bought the right to find out who was wrong. The tractor reached Walter's farm just before sunset. It came home exactly the way it had arrived at the auction, on a trailer. Silent, Walter backed beside the machine shed and began removing the chains. His neighbor, Ray Collins, crossed the road when he saw the faded tractor. "What'd you pay?" $140. Ray walked around it. Cracked tire. Rust. Dead battery. Does it run? No. Engine turn? Walter looked at the front of the tractor. Not yet. Ray stopped. Not yet? Walter ignored him and rolled the machine beneath the shed. Now the auction was gone. No laughter. No bidders. No one left to prove wrong. That made the tractor more intimidating. At the auction, Walter had risked $140 on a question. Now he had to answer it. He placed the receipt on the workbench beside an old metal toolbox. Ray leaned against the fender. "So what do you think is wrong?" Walter opened the side panel. "I think everybody started with the engine. That seems reasonable." "It is." Walter crouched near the front. "That doesn't make it proven." He pressed the belt, still unusually tight, then followed it toward the pulley carrying the bright wear mark he had noticed earlier. Ray watched. "You think that's stopping the engine?" "I think it might be stopping something." That distinction mattered. Walter was not trying to prove his theory. He was trying to remove it as a possibility. No new battery. No starter. No engine parts. No attempt to pull-start the tractor. First, isolate the resistance. Walter selected 2 wrenches and began loosening the belt-driven assembly. The first fastener resisted, then moved. Metal creaked. The belt tension changed slightly. Walter stopped. Ray leaned closer. "What?" Walter pressed the belt again. More movement now. Something in the system had released. Not much, but enough. Ray lowered his voice. "You onto something?" Walter shook his head. "Not until we test it." He loosened the adjustment farther. For the first time in years, the belt sagged. Walter looked from the pulley to the crankshaft. If the engine was truly seized, removing the belt would change nothing. The crankshaft would still refuse to move. But if something driven by that belt had locked solid, then the crowd had mistaken resistance outside the engine for failure inside it. Walter reached for the belt with both hands. Ray held the flashlight. "What happens if the engine still won't turn?" Walter pulled the belt toward the edge of the pulley. "Then I paid $140 to learn I was wrong? And if it turns?" Walter looked at the tractor. Then everybody diagnosed the engine before they actually tested it. The belt slipped halfway free. Walter changed his grip. One more pull. It dropped into his hands. He placed it on the floor, then reached toward the pulley that had bothered him since the auction. "Now," he said quietly, "we find out what's really stuck." Walter pulled the belt free. It did not come off easily. The rubber had stiffened with age, and years of dirt had worked itself into the grooves of the pulley. Ray held the flashlight while Walter worked it loose a little at a time. Finally, the belt slipped over the edge and fell into Walter's hand. For a moment, neither man spoke. Walter laid it on the floor. Then he reached toward the pulley that had caught his attention at the auction. He grabbed it with one hand, tried to turn it. Nothing. He changed position and pulled harder. Still nothing. Ray leaned closer. "Frozen?" Walter nodded. "Looks that way." The pulley was connected to a belt-driven component at the front of the engine. Under normal conditions, the crankshaft turned the belt. The belt turned the pulley, and the pulley allowed that component to spin with the engine, but this one had locked solid. Walter pushed against it again. No movement. Not even a fraction. Ray frowned. So that's what stopped the tractor? Walter shook his head. We don't know that yet. That distinction mattered. A seized accessory was suspicious. It was not proof. The engine itself could still be locked internally. Walter had seen machines with 2 failures at once. Old equipment did not owe anyone a simple answer. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the side of the engine. Now came the test he had paid $140 to perform. At the auction, everyone had asked the same question. Would the tractor start? Walter was asking something more basic. Could the engine turn? Those were not the same question. A tractor could refuse to start for dozens of reasons. Bas fuel, weak ignition, low compression, a dead battery, corroded wiring, clogged carburetor. But if the crankshaft itself could still rotate freely, then the most frightening diagnosis in the auction yard, a seized engine, was probably wrong. Walter fitted a socket and bar where he could carefully apply force to the engine. Ray watched from behind him. You think it'll move? Walter tightened his grip. We're about to find out. He pulled. Nothing. Walter stopped. Ray exhaled. For half a second, the old man wondered whether the crowd had been right after all. He reset the bar, adjusted his position, then applied steady pressure instead of jerking it. The metal resisted. Walter leaned harder, and then it moved. Barely. Maybe an inch at the end of the bar. Walter froze. Ray stepped forward. Did that turn? Walter said nothing. He reset the tool, pulled again. This time the crankshaft moved farther. Smoothly. Not freely enough to call the engine healthy, but it moved. Walter turned it through another section of its rotation. Then another. Compression pushed back against him at intervals. That resistance made him smile. Ray saw it. What? Walter released the bar. The engine isn't stuck. Ray looked at the tractor. Then at the belt lying on the floor. You're sure? Walter rotated the crankshaft again. It moved through another cycle. If the pistons were rusted solid in the cylinders, I wouldn't be doing this. Ray stared at him. So everybody at the auction made a reasonable guess? Walter looked toward the frozen pulley. Just the wrong one. That was the entire difference. At the auction, the starter had tried to turn the engine and everything connected to it. Something resisted. The starter loaded down. Nothing appeared to move. From 20 feet away, it looked exactly like the engine itself had locked. But Walter had noticed the strange belt tension, the fresh scrape, the pulley that seemed to be fighting the rest of the system, so instead of opening the engine, he had disconnected one source of resistance. And once the belt was removed, the crankshaft could turn. The tractor had not proven itself alive, but it had just proven that everyone had buried the wrong part. Ray picked up the old belt. That little thing fooled the whole auction? Walter shook his head. No. He pointed toward the seized component. That helped. Then he tapped the engine block. But what fooled them was deciding what was wrong before they tested it. Ray looked back at the frozen pulley. What is it? Walter examined the assembly more closely. The shaft showed corrosion near the bearing. There was evidence that moisture had gotten where it should not have. Years of sitting had done what years of work sometimes failed to do. The bearing had locked, and with the belt drawn tight around it, the entire front drive system had been fighting itself every time someone tried the starter. On a stronger electrical system, perhaps the belt might have slipped. Perhaps something else would have moved. But with an old battery circuit, tired cables, years of corrosion, and a component that refused to turn, the result had been convincing enough. Hit the starter. Hard clunk. No rotation. Dead engine. Case closed. Except Walter had never closed the case. He picked up the auction receipt from the workbench. $140. Ray laughed quietly. You knew? Walter looked at him. No. You knew enough to buy it. That's different. Walter folded the receipt again. I knew the diagnosis didn't fit. That was the thing experience had given him. Not certainty. Better questions. Ray looked toward the tractor. So we put a new belt on it and start it? Walter almost laughed. No. Ray's smile disappeared. Why not? Because we just proved the engine turns. Walter opened the fuel tank cap and smelled the air above it. His face tightened immediately. That doesn't mean it runs. The fuel had been sitting for years. The battery cables were badly corroded. The ignition system had not been tested. The oil was old. The cooling system was unknown. And whatever had seized at the front would have to be repaired or replaced before the tractor could work normally again. Walter had won one argument. He had not restored a tractor. He walked to the workbench and started making a list. Drain fuel. Check oil. Inspect plugs. Clean connections. Test ignition. Inspect cooling system. Repair the seized component. Ray stared at the growing list. I thought you just proved you got a bargain. Walter shook his head. I proved I didn't buy a seized engine. He looked back at the tractor. Those are two very different things. That night, the old machine remained exactly where Walter had parked it. It still had not started. It still had not moved under its own power. And if someone from the auction had driven past the shed, they would have seen nothing that changed their opinion. A dead-looking tractor, an old man, a toolbox, and $140 already spent. But inside that engine, the crankshaft could turn. That single fact changed everything. Because the crowd had judged the tractor by the symptom, they could see Walter had isolated the cause. They had never tested. Now the question was no longer whether the engine was dead. It was whether Walter could make it breathe again. By the next morning, Walter had already learned enough to know the tractor had been misjudged. But misjudged did not mean repaired. He started with the fuel. What came out of the tank barely smelled like gasoline anymore. It was dark, stale, heavy with the sour odor of years spent sitting in heat and cold. Ray stood nearby holding an old drain pan. You think it would have started on that? Walter watched the fuel run out. No. Then we found the problem. Walter shook his head. We found a problem. That was the part Ray was beginning to understand. Old machines rarely failed politely. One problem could hide another. Years of sitting could turn small weaknesses into a chain of failures. And Walter had no intention of assuming the first thing he fixed would be the last. He drained the tank, cleaned the sediment bowl, blew through the fuel line, then opened the carburetor and found what he expected. Varnish, sticky residue, a float that did not move as freely as it should. Nothing dramatic, nothing impossible, but enough to keep fuel from reaching the engine correctly. Walter cleaned each piece slowly. Ray watched him work. You ever get tired of taking things apart? Walter smiled. Only when I have to put them back together twice. By noon, the fuel system was clean enough to test. Walter moved to the electrical side. The battery cables were worse than they had looked at the auction. Green corrosion had crept beneath the insulation near one terminal. A ground connection was coated with rust. The battery itself was useless. Walter cleaned every connection before replacing anything. Then he installed a battery he already had in the shed. Ray leaned over the fender. Now? Walter ignored him. He pulled the spark plugs, checked each one, cleaned what could be cleaned. Tested for spark. Weak. Inconsistent. He adjusted the ignition and checked again. Better. Not perfect, but enough to try. By late afternoon, the tractor looked almost exactly the same as it had the day before. Same faded paint. Same cracked tire. Samarust. But inside, several systems had changed. Fresh fuel. Clean connections. Oil checked. Ignition tested. The seized front component had been isolated for the moment, so it could no longer lock the belt drive. Walter climbed onto the seat. Ray stood beside the barn. You want me to get the camera? Walter gave him a look. Ray laughed. Just asking? Walter turned the key. The starter engaged. This time, the engine turned. Not quickly, but it turned. Rar, 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 rar. Ray's smile widened. That's already more than it did yesterday. Walter kept listening. He stopped. Waited. Tried again. Brr, rrr. Nothing. No ignition. No cough. Walter released the key. Ray's smile faded. What now? Walter climbed down. He checked the fuel line. Fuel was reaching the carburetor. He checked spark again. Present. He tried a third time. The engine rotated steadily. Still nothing. For the first time since bringing the tractor home, Walter's confidence shifted. Not disappeared. Shifted. Because now the easy explanation was gone. The engine could turn. It had fuel. It had spark. At least enough spark to see. And still, it refused to run. Ray leaned against the workbench. You think there's something wrong inside? Walter looked at the engine. Could be. Those two words changed the mood in the shed. Until then, every discovery had moved in Walter's favor. The seized component, the free crankshaft, the bad fuel, the corroded connections. Each problem had been visible, repairable, affordable. But if the engine had low compression, stuck valves, bad timing, or internal damage from sitting, the story could change quickly. Walter removed his cap and wiped his forehead. Ray nodded toward the auction receipt on the bench. Still feeling good about the 140? Walter looked at it, then back at the tractor. I didn't buy a running tractor. Ray waited. Walter continued. I bought one I thought wasn't dead. That sound like the same thing to you? No. Walter climbed back down beside the engine. That distinction mattered more now than ever. He had been right about the crowd's diagnosis. But being right about one thing did not guarantee he would be right about everything else. He took a compression gauge from the bottom drawer of his toolbox. Ray watched him screw it into the first cylinder. What are we checking now? Walter turned the gauge so he could see the face. Whether this thing has enough life left to light the fuel? He climbed onto the seat again. Turned the key. The needle jumped. Walter stopped. Moved to the next cylinder. Then the next. By the time he finished, Ray could tell from Walter's expression that the numbers were not what he wanted. Not disastrous, but uneven. One cylinder was noticeably weaker than the others. Ray looked at him. Bad? Walter stared at the gauge. Not good. The tractor had just given them another clue, and this one would not be solved by removing a belt. Walter looked at the engine as the afternoon light faded across the shed. The crowd at the auction had been wrong, but Walter still had not proven himself right. Because a tractor that can turn is not the same thing as a tractor that can work, and somewhere inside that old engine, one more problem was waiting to be found. Walter did not order a single part that night. That surprised Ray more than anything. By then, they had already found enough wrong with the tractor to justify a shopping list. A seized belt-driven component, a ruined battery, corroded cables, stale fuel, a dirty carburetor, weak ignition, and now one cylinder that was not building compression like the others. Ray stood beside the workbench, with his arms folded. So what do we replace? Walter looked at him. Nothing yet. Ray frowned. You've got a weak cylinder. I've got a low reading. Same thing. Walter shook his head. No. A reading is evidence. It isn't the diagnosis. That was the mistake Walter had watched people make for years. A machine produced one bad symptom, and someone immediately started buying parts. No spark? Buy a coil. Slow crank? Buy a starter. Low compression? Order rings. Walter called it throwing money at a question. Sometimes it worked. Often it only made an expensive problem harder to understand. He pulled a wooden stool beside the tractor and opened an old notebook. Ray laughed. You keeping a diary now? Walter ignored him. He wrote 4 words across the page. Fuel. Spark. Compression. Timing. Then below them, what do we know? Fuel was reaching the carburetor. Spark existed. The engine rotated. 3 cylinders showed acceptable compression. One did not. That narrowed the problem. Walter removed the weak cylinder spark plug again. Then he added a small amount of oil through the plug hole. Ray watched. What's that supposed to do? If the rings aren't sealing, the oil can help them seal for a moment. And if the number goes up, we learn something. Walter installed the gauge. Cranked the engine. The needle rose. A little. Not enough. Walter stared at it. Ray leaned closer. That good? It tells me not to blame the rings first. Walter wrote another note. The weakness might be higher in the engine. A valve not closing. A valve stuck from years of sitting. Carbon or rust on a valve seat. Something preventing the cylinder from sealing. Walter removed the valve cover. The metal underneath was coated with old oil, but nothing looked destroyed. Ray turned the engine slowly while Walter watched the valve train. One rocker moved, then another. Walter followed the sequence. Everything seemed normal, until one valve came back up. Almost. Walter leaned closer. Stop. Ray stopped turning. Walter pressed lightly against the rocker, then looked at the valve stem. It was not fully returning. Not by much. A man rushing through the job might have missed it. Walter almost did. He rotated the engine again. The valve opened, then returned, and stopped just short. Ray saw it this time. That's supposed to do that? No. Walter's voice was quiet. There it was. Another small failure with a large consequence. If the valve could not close completely, the cylinder could not seal properly. If the cylinder could not seal, compression dropped. If compression dropped far enough, the fuel-air mixture might never ignite reliably. The tractor could crank all day and still refuse to run. Ray pointed at the valve. So we found it? We found something wrong. Walter still refused to celebrate. He applied penetrating oil around the stem and worked the mechanism carefully. Again. Years of sitting had left the movement stiff, not completely frozen, just enough to prevent a clean seal. Walter worked slowly. Too much force could turn an easy repair into a bent component or damaged guide. Ray became impatient before Walter did. You could probably just hit it. Walter looked at him. You could probably hit a lot of things. Ray smiled. Walter didn't. Doesn't make it repair work. For nearly an hour, Walter worked the valve through its travel. Lubricate. Move. Inspect. Repeat. Gradually. The resistance changed. The valve began returning farther. Then fully. Walter rotated the engine several more times. Each cycle looked better. He reinstalled the compression gauge. Ray leaned against the fender. This better be worth all that. Walter cranked the engine. The needle jumped. Higher. He stopped. Tested again. Almost even with the other cylinders. Ray slapped the fender. There you go. Walter immediately looked at him. Don't hit the tractor. Ray laughed. For the first time that day, Walter laughed too, but only briefly, because compression was only one piece of the system. The engine now had a better chance of running. It still had to prove it. Walter replaced the spark plug, checked the ignition timing, then stopped. The timing was off. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. Walter adjusted it carefully. Ray shook his head. How many things can be wrong with one tractor? Walter closed the distributor. 4 years is a long time to sit. That was the lesson hidden beneath the machine's failures. The tractor had never suffered one catastrophic death. It had accumulated neglect, one small problem, then another, then another. Eventually, those ordinary failures stacked together, until everyone looking at the machine saw only one conclusion. Dead. Walter climbed onto the seat. Ray stepped closer. You going to try it? Walter placed his hand on the key. Yes? Ray smiled. This the one? Walter looked down at the faded hood. No idea. And that was exactly why he trusted the process. Not because it guaranteed success, because every test had removed one more wrong answer. Walter turned the key. The starter caught. The engine began to rotate. Brrr. Then, a sharp cough came from beneath the hood. Walter froze. Ray's head snapped toward the exhaust. A second cough. Then silence. Neither man moved. The tractor had not started. But for the first time since anyone had dragged it into the auction yard, the engine had tried. Walter did not turn the key again immediately. That first cough mattered too much to waste. For nearly 2 days, the tractor had given them nothing but resistance. A locked accessory, bad fuel, corroded connections, weak ignition, low compression on one cylinder, a valve that refused to close properly. Now, for the first time, the engine had answered back. Not with power, not with a clean idle. With one sharp cough, then another. Ray stepped toward the exhaust. You heard that. Walter kept his hand off the key. I heard it. That means it's going to run. Walter looked at him. It means it burned something. Ray shook his head. You really don't celebrate early. Do you? Walter climbed down from the seat. Celebrating doesn't fix timing. The engine had tried to fire, but trying was not enough. Walter checked the distributor one more time, then the fuel mixture, then the choke linkage. Everything was close. That was sometimes more frustrating than being completely wrong. A machine that gave no response could be tested logically. A machine that almost ran could tempt a man into changing 5 things at once. Walter refused. One adjustment. One test. That was the rule. He moved the timing slightly, climbed back onto the seat, turned the key. Cough. Cough. The engine kicked hard enough to shake the exhaust stack, then stopped. Ray laughed. That's better. Walter said nothing. He tried again. The engine caught for less than a second. One uneven burst. Then silence. Walter released the key. The shed smelled different now. Fresh gasoline. Old oil. A trace of exhaust. It was the smell of an engine that had not yet decided whether it wanted to live. Walter climbed down again. He removed one plug. Looked at it. Tout vet. Flooding? Ray asked. Walter nodded. Some. He dried the plug. Opened the choke. Waited. Then checked the carburetor adjustment again. Ray paced behind him. You know, most people would just keep cranking. Most people buy batteries that way. Walter reinstalled the plug, then waited another minute. That minute felt longer than the entire auction. But now, Walter had invested more than money. The tractor had become a test of his judgment, not his pride exactly. Walter had lived too long to confuse being wrong with being ruined. But he wanted to know whether the clues he had followed actually led somewhere, whether 60 years of listening to machinery still meant something. He climbed into the seat again. Ray stopped pacing. Walter put one hand on the throttle, the other on the key. Ready? Ray asked. Walter turned it. The starter engaged. The engine coughed. Walter held the key. Another cough. Then 3 cylinders fired almost together. The tractor lurched against its own compression. The exhaust stack jumped. A cloud of gray smoke burst upward. Ray took one step back. The engine died. Silence returned. But this time Walter smiled. Ray pointed at him. There. I saw that. Walter ignored him. What? That smile? Walter looked down at the controls. It's closer. Ray laughed. Closer? That thing just tried to climb out of the grave? Walter waited. Then tried again. The starter rolled the engine over. 1 revolution. 2. 3. Esulina feel. Then another. Then, the entire engine caught. Not smoothly. Not beautifully. It came alive in a violent, uneven rhythm that shook the hood and sent another cloud of old residue through the exhaust. Walter released the key. The engine kept running. Ray stopped laughing. For several seconds, neither man said anything. The old tractor sat beneath the shed roof, trembling against its mounts. Pop. Pop pop. Rumble. Pop. The idle wandered. The exhaust smoked. A beltless pulley at the front remained disconnected. Nothing about it looked restored. But the crankshaft was turning under its own power. Walter lowered the throttle slightly. The engine stumbled. He caught it before it died. Ray stepped closer. You did it? Walter kept listening. Not yet. What do you mean? Not yet? Walter pointed toward the oil pressure gauge. The needle had begun to rise. He watched it carefully. Then the temperature gauge. Then the exhaust. Then the engine itself. Starting was only the first test. A machine could run for 30 seconds and still contain a problem waiting to destroy it. Walter listened for knocks. Deep ones. Sharp ones. Anything that suggested damaged bearings or something worse. There was noise. Old tractors always had noise. But nothing that made him reach for the key. 30 seconds became a minute. A minute became 2. The smoke began to thin. The idle slowly settled. Ray walked around the tractor as though he was seeing a different machine. This was the dead tractor? Walter nodded. The one nobody wanted? Same one. Ray stared at the engine. You're going to tell those guys at the auction? Walter looked at him. No. Ray frowned. Why not? Walter adjusted the throttle again. Because it doesn't need to win an argument. The tractor answered for him. For the next 10 minutes, Walter let it run. He did not rev it hard. He did not drive it. The seized front component still needed repair. The cooling system still needed a proper test. The tires needed attention. The hydraulics had not been checked. There was a long way between running and working, but every few seconds, Walter glanced at the engine and listened. The sound was changing, not dramatically, just settling. After years of silence, oil was moving again, Valves were cycling. Pistons were rising and falling. Heat was returning to cast iron that had sat cold through 4 winters. Walter finally reached for the key. Ray looked surprised. "You're shutting it off?" Walter nodded. "Why?" "Because now I know it starts." He turned the key. The engine died. The sudden silence felt almost unnatural. Ray looked at the tractor, then at Walter. "What now?" Walter stepped down. "Now we make it useful." Over the next several days, he repaired the seized front assembly, instead of forcing it back into service. He replaced the old belt, flushed the cooling system, changed the fluids, inspected the brakes, checked the hydraulics, repaired the worst electrical connections. He did not restore the paint. He did not replace every dented panel. Walter had not bought the tractor to make it beautiful. He wanted it to work. The first time he finally drove it out of the shed, Ray stood by the fence. Walter eased the tractor into gear. The transmission complained slightly, then caught. The old machine moved forward. 10 feet. 20. 50. Walter turned at the edge of the yard and came back. The tractor was slow, loud, faded, still ugly enough that most buyers at the auction would have walked past it. But it was moving under its own power. Ray raised both hands. Walter only nodded. Then he drove past him toward the back field. The same tractor that had arrived on a trailer as scrap was now pulling itself across the farm, and somewhere 20 miles away, the men who had laughed at Walter still believed the old man had paid $140 for a dead machine. They had no idea it was already back at work. 3 weeks later, Walter took the tractor back into town, not to prove anything. He needed hydraulic fluid. That was all. The old machine had already spent several days moving hay wagons, dragging a small disc, and pulling a utility trailer around the farm. It still smoked a little on cold starts. The paint was still terrible. The cracked rear tire still needed replacing. But it started, it moved, and more importantly, it worked. Walter could have taken his pickup to town. Instead, he climbed onto the tractor early Saturday morning and headed down the county road. Ray saw him pass and immediately understood. "You're doing this on purpose," he called from across the fence. Walter kept driving. "Nope." Ray laughed. Walter did not look back. The tractor moved at a steady pace, engine rumbling beneath the faded hood. Cars passed. A few people waved. Walter reached the farm supply store just before noon. He parked beside the loading dock. The engine idled roughly for a moment, then settled. Walter shut it down and climbed off. He had barely reached the entrance when someone behind him said, "No way." Walter stopped. He recognized the voice before he turned around. The man with the red beard from the auction stood beside a pickup truck, staring at the tractor. For a second, neither man spoke. Then the man pointed. "That's the one." Walter looked back at the tractor. "Which one?" The man laughed. "Come on." "The dead tractor." Walter shrugged. "Doesn't look very dead." The man walked closer. He circled it the same way buyers had circled it at the auction. Only this time, he was not looking for reasons to walk away. He was looking for an explanation. "You rebuilt it?" "No." "New engine?" "No." "Pulled the head?" Walter shook his head. "Never opened the engine." The man stared at him. That answer bothered him more than if Walter had said he spent $2,000 rebuilding it. Because a rebuild would have preserved the auction crowd's original diagnosis. If Walter had replaced pistons, rings, bearings, or the entire engine, then everyone could still say they had been right. The tractor had been dead. Walter had simply brought it back with money. But that was not what happened. What was wrong with it? Walter looked toward the front pulley, a bearing locked in one of the belt-driven components. The man frowned. "That stopped the whole motor?" "It made it look that way." Walter explained only the basics. The accessory seized. The belt held everything under load. The starter hit resistance. Everyone assumed the resistance was inside the engine. Walter removed the belt, then checked whether the crankshaft itself could turn. The man stared at him, and it did. Walter nodded. "Then I found the rest." "The rest?" 4 years of sitting. Walter counted them off casually. Bad fuel. Corroded connections. Weak ignition. A sticking valve. Timing slightly out. The man whistled. So it wasn't one problem? No. Walter looked at the tractor. It was a pile of small ones. Another pickup pulled into the lot. The driver stepped out. He had been at the auction too. Then another man came from inside the store. Within minutes, Walter found himself standing beside the same tractor with 3 men who had watched him buy it. One of them recognized him immediately. 140 Walt. The others laughed. Walter smiled. The nickname had changed. At the auction, it had meant fool. Now it meant something else. The man in the stained cap looked beneath the hood. How much you got in it now? Walter gave him the rough total. Battery, he already owned. Flauts, a belt. A few ignition pieces. Repair to the seized assembly. Nothing close to an engine. Rebuild. The man shook his head slowly. I'd have sworn that motor was locked. So would most people. You didn't? Walter thought about it. I thought it might be. The man looked confused. Then why bid? Walter leaned against the fender. Because might be and is aren't the same thing. Nobody laughed at that. One of the men opened the tractor's hood farther and looked inside. You selling it? Walter shook his head. I just got it working. I'll give you 800. Walter smiled. No. 1,000. No. The red-bearded man laughed. Now who's making bad auction decisions? Walter looked at him. Could be me. But he had no intention of selling. The tractor had already earned its place. It could pull wagons, run light equipment, move firewood, do jobs that otherwise put hours on Walter's better tractor. Its value was no longer determined by what someone would pay for it. Its value was measured in work. The store manager loaded 2 containers of hydraulic fluid onto the tractor. Before Walter climbed back onto the seat, the red-bearded man stopped him. I gotta ask. Walter turned. How'd you catch it? Walter looked toward the pulley, then toward the men standing around him. The starter sounded like it was hitting something solid. That's why we thought the engine was seized. I know. So what did you hear different? Walter paused. I didn't hear enough to know. The men waited. Walter continued. I saw enough to doubt. He pointed toward the front of the engine. The belt was too tight. Pulley had a fresh wear mark. Something had been fighting to move. The red-bearded man nodded slowly. So you knew where to look? Walter climbed onto the tractor. No. He turned the key. The old engine fired after 2 revolutions. Walter looked down at them. I knew where to look first. The engine settled into its uneven rumble. The men stepped back. Nobody made a joke this time. Walter eased the tractor into gear and pulled away from the store. In the mirror, he could still see them watching. 3 weeks earlier, those same men had laughed because an old farmer paid $140 for a tractor they believed was dead. Now they were standing in a parking lot trying to calculate what they had missed. Walter never turned around. He had already gotten the only answer he needed. The tractor was working, and the crowd had finally stopped laughing. Walter never wrote down what the tractor was worth. At the auction, the answer had been easy. 140 yuan. 3 weeks later, someone offered him $800. Then $1. Ling ling ling. Ray thought he was crazy for refusing. 10 times your money. Walter looked toward the tractor. That's only true if money is what I want from it. Ray frowned. Then what did you buy it for? Walter pointed toward the field. Work. Over the next few months, the answer became clearer. The old tractor pulled hay wagons, dragged firewood from the tree line, moved fencing supplies, pulled a utility trailer, handled small jobs. Walter no longer needed to put on his better machine. None of those jobs were dramatic. But every hour the old tractor worked was an hour another machine did not have to. That was value, Walter understood. He never repainted it. The faded hood stayed faded. The dents remained. He replaced the cracked tire when it became unsafe, changed fluids, replaced a hydraulic hose before it failed, fixed what affected function, ignored what only affected appearance. Ray asked him once, "You ever going to paint this thing?" Walter shook his head. Paint doesn't pull a wagon. That was partly humor. Mostly, it was philosophy. The tractor looked almost exactly like the machine everyone had rejected. Walter preferred it that way. The rust remained. The scratches remained. So did the evidence of how easily appearance had been mistaken for condition. One afternoon, Walter parked it beside his newer tractor. The difference was obvious. More horsepower. Better hydraulics. Cleaner controls. Far more comfort. Ray pointed between them. Which one would you rather own? The newer one. Ray laughed. Finally, Walter smiled. But that's the wrong question. What's the right one? Walter rested his hand on the faded hood. How much useful work can I get from something everybody else priced as dead? That was why the $1,000 offer had never mattered much. A resale price measured what another buyer might pay once. Walter measured value every time the tractor started and completed another job. The bargain was not that he bought something for $140 and could sell it for more. The bargain was that the auction crowd had priced the machine according to what they believed had failed. Walter had priced the uncertainty, then tested it, and every trip across the field kept proving the difference. That evening, after another load of firewood, Walter parked the tractor beside the shed. As the engine cooled, the old metal clicked softly. Walter listened. The sound reminded him of another tractor, another field, and another man who had taught him, long before any auction, that a machine should never be sentenced by the first explanation. His father. Walter kept the auction receipt in the top drawer of his workbench. He did not frame it. He did not show it to visitors. Most days, he forgot it was there. But every once in a while, when he opened the drawer for a screwdriver or a box of old bolts, he would see the folded piece of paper, Inspirational, and for a moment, he would remember another tractor, not this one, a smaller one, green paint, narrow front wheels, a cracked seat his father had patched with black tape. Walter had been 14, the summer that tractor stopped in the hayfield. It was one of those afternoons when heat seemed to press the whole farm flat. His father was behind schedule. Rain was coming. The hay needed to be cut. And the tractor quit. Walter remembered the panic more clearly than the failure. He had been young enough to believe every problem was permanent. The engine coughed once, then died. Walter tried the starter. Nothing useful happened. He immediately said, "Motor's gone." His father looked at him. "You open it?" "No." "You test compression?" "No." "You check fuel?" Walter hesitated. "No." His father wiped sweat from his forehead. "Then how do you know the motor's gone?" Walter had no answer. He only knew the tractor had stopped. To a 14-year-old boy, standing in a field with rain moving closer, that felt like proof. His father did not lecture him. He simply started checking. Fuel first, then spark, then connections. Eventually he found the problem. A blockage in the fuel system, small, ordinary, repairable. The tractor was running again before the rain reached them. Walter remembered climbing onto the fender as they drove back toward the barn. He had asked his father how he knew where to look. The old man answered without turning around. "I didn't." Walter had been confused. "You fixed it?" "I found it." "What's the difference?" His father slowed the tractor near the gate. "Knowing before you check is guessing." Then he looked at Walter. "Checking until you know is work." Walter had carried that sentence for nearly 60 years. It followed him through broken balers, frozen pumps, sick calves, dry summers, bad harvests, engines that really were ruined, and plenty that only looked that way. His father had never taught him to believe everything could be saved. That would have been foolish. Some machines were finished. Some fields were exhausted. Some repairs cost more than replacement. Walter had learned those lessons too. What his father taught him was something narrower and harder. Do not confuse the first explanation with the final answer. Years later, when his father died, Walter inherited a few tools, a worn socket, a grease gun, 2 pipe wrenches, and a small red-handled screwdriver, the same screwdriver now lying in Walter's toolbox. The handle was chipped. The metal shaft had darkened with age. It was worth almost nothing. Walter would not have sold it. Not because the tool was special, because every time he held it, he remembered the hands that had taught him how to use it. One evening, Ray came into the shed while Walter was changing oil in the $140 tractor. The old screwdriver was lying on the bench. Ray picked it up. "You've had this thing forever." Walter looked over. "Put it down." Ray laughed and set it back. "Dochi." Walter wiped his hands. "My dad's." Ray looked at the screwdriver again. For a few seconds, the shed was quiet. Then Ray asked, "That where you learned all this?" Walter glanced toward the tractor. Most of it. He would have bought that thing? Walter thought about the auction. The laughter. The frozen pulley. The engine, everyone called dead. Then he smiled. No. Ray looked surprised. No? My father was cheaper than I am. Ray laughed. Walter did too. Then his expression softened, but he would have checked it. That was the part that mattered. Walter had spent most of his life believing his father taught him how to repair machines. Only when he got older did he understand that the lesson had never really been about machines. It was about judgment, about resisting the comfort of a quick conclusion, about looking once more when everyone else had already decided. Walter opened the workbench drawer and saw the auction receipt. He placed the old screwdriver beside it, two almost worthless objects. One from his father, one from a tractor everyone had abandoned. Walter looked at them for a moment, then closed the drawer. Outside, the old tractor sat cooling after another afternoon of work. Its metal clicked softly as the heat left the engine. Walter listened, then smiled. His father had been gone for many years, but some lessons kept working long after the man who taught them was gone. By the end of the season, nobody called it the dead tractor anymore. It was simply Walter's old red tractor, the one that started a little slowly on cold mornings, the one with faded paint and a rough seat, the one that pulled wagons, moved firewood, hauled fencing supplies, and kept doing work nobody at the auction expected it to do again. One evening, Walter drove it across the back field with an empty trailer behind him. The sun hung low over the pasture. The engine rumbled steadily beneath the hood. Not quietly, not perfectly, but steadily. Walter remembered the auction. The starter hitting hard, the engine refusing to move. Then the words that followed. Locked, seized, scrap. None of the men who said them had been foolish. Given what they saw, the conclusion made sense. That was what made the lesson important. Experience was not always knowing the answer. Sometimes it was knowing when the answer had not been proven yet. Walter thought about his father, about the lesson he had carried for nearly 60 years. Knowing before you check is guessing. Checking until you know is work. His father had never taught him that everything could be saved. Some machines really were finished. Some repairs cost more than they were worth. Sometimes scrap was simply scrap. But there was another mistake too. Calling something worthless before understanding why it had stopped working. Walter slowed beside the fence. The tractor idled beneath him. The crowd had seen a machine that would not turn. Walter had seen exactly the same thing. He had simply asked one more question. Was the engine itself actually stuck? That question cost him $140. The answer gave him a working tractor. Walter shifted into gear. The old machine moved forward, the trailer bouncing lightly behind it. No crowd watched. No auctioneer announced what it was worth now. There was no need. Its value was moving beneath Walter's hands, one revolution at a time, because broken and misunderstood can look exactly the same until someone checks the right thing.